to it because I'm no expert in this. It's actually
I want to welcome you to our second small business panel of the day. I'm Amy Tushin. I work with eScience and Technology Solutions, and I am the local chapter small business chair. I also want to introduce Katie Helwig with AFCEA International. She's the Director of Corporate Development, and she actually works with small and large businesses to help integrate AFCEA into what you might be doing. So thank you, Katie, for being here. Without further ado, so the afternoon's panel is addressing NIST, SP 800-171 and DFARS 7012, and I want to introduce our moderator, actually, or call Dan up here. He is going to introduce our panels, and we'll get right started on that. And we actually purposefully leave time for Q&A. I have a microphone here that I'm going to bring to you if you have those, because the session is being recorded for them to put out later. Thank you.
And you will be broadcast on the evening news, and life is all good.
There you go. As long as it's short.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Bjorklund. I work for Sabine Solutions, and my pleasure to kind of begin a discussion about NIST 800-171 compliance and DFARS Clause 7012. So just to start off with, is everybody familiar with what NIST 800-171 and DFARS 7012 is? For all of us small business leaders, everybody involved in the small business, I think probably all of us have become aware of it, if not directly, then probably tangentially. The requirement for Department of Defense contractors to be compliant with NIST 800-171 and a DFARS 7012 was supposed to have taken place in December of last year, which was already a 2-year postponement from an earlier requirement that folks be compliant. Obviously, it has been an interesting journey and will continue to be so. So we'll spend some time talking about it today. We really would like it to be more of a discussion and interaction with you. We'll discuss some of our findings and the things that we've learned during our journey towards compliance, and maybe some of the high points or things that are really important to remember. I'm joined obviously by our panel, Mr. Bob Hall from Sabine Solutions, President of Sabine Solutions, Ms. Angie Leinert from Intelligenesis, Randall Zapata from Zapata Technology, and Mr. Jay Roy from Omnitech. And so I'm going to set the stage sort of. We're just going to discuss some of the background and summarize 800-171. And then we'll ask each of them to present their thoughts. And after that, we'll take questions. And at any point during this presentation, if you have a question or something that you want to point out, we're hoping that we can all learn from each other here. I'm certainly not an expert. Maybe some of you are, so please feel free to share what you've learned and know. Hey, that's what we're going to do. Life is good. And so what is this all about? It's often difficult to summarize what the importance of 800-171 is. In some cases, we've talked to small business leaders who think it's just another one of those gotchas, another one of those ways for someone to throw a wrench in the works. And really it isn't. From a general perspective, it was implemented to establish structure and protection around that sensitive information that we've formerly always seen as FOUO, for official use only, but things that include enough information that should an adversary get a hold of it, that they would be able to derive some sort of intent about particular programs or information or things that we were working on. So the intent was to put sort of a protective boundary around that specific information that's important to the government and their programs. That information isn't always something that is after a contract is awarded or after a program has begun. Sometimes that information is needed in relation to just getting it started, just doing an RFP or in an RFI. And so there had to be a mechanism or a way to help protect that information. As we began the journey, 2-3 years ago or so, like I said, it sounded like it was going to be very onerous and it was going to be very significant and oh my goodness, how are we going to do this? But as you kind of work through the steps and you work with folks who are experts in cybersecurity, what you find is it's less of a technical challenge and it's more of a process challenge. So integrating those new processes and, in fact, changing the way that we do business is probably one of the greater challenges of what compliance actually means. And so I've been asked a couple of times by small business leaders, well, how do we know when we're compliant? And what you really know that you're compliant is when you are doing business differently today than you did before. And granted, that's probably the biggest challenge, but it is also the biggest piece of evidence when you're actually doing things a little bit differently. So why all the hubbub? Why all the noise about this? Why the importance? And I think we've probably become somewhat familiar with why this is all important. From a research paper from BitSite, tens of thousands of government contractors hold sensitive data or perform services on behalf of the government, working on sensitive programs or important programs in support of our nation and national security. And I think we've probably seen some of that evidence in the media. There's another S3 bucket disclosure on Amazon, or there's more documents that have been released in relation to a fighter program or a Navy program. I don't know how many of you were affected by the OPM breach a number of years ago, so there's been a few of us who have had a direct effect on this, and many of them are existential or extraneous. And of course, the financial information from the big Equifax breach, which was wholly and totally preventable. In most cases, had we just had some processes in place and made sure that we followed them. And so we'll get a little bit more specific about who is most affected by these, who needs to make sure that they're in compliance, who needs to make sure that they're applying these security rules and controls to their daily operations and the information that they store. I thought it was interesting from the keynote this morning from General Crawford, and he said, well, one of the Army's biggest challenges, or one of the biggest focus areas, is moving away from specific technologies to protect the network, but interested in protecting the information or protecting the data. I thought that was very germane to what we're talking about here today, because in many cases there are different ways and different technologies that can be used to do this, but in the end we need to be able to protect that data. The requirements to apply all of this apply to all components of non-federal information systems. So that's probably important, is non-federal information systems. So those are the information systems or processes that we, as folks who are doing work with the federal government, not just DoD, but with the federal government in general, for our systems and our processes, the way that we use and store information that is relevant to government programs and support. This is for protecting CUI, which is known as Controlled Unclassified Information. We'll define that in a little bit more detail in a few slides. The requirements are intended for use by federal agencies in contractual vehicles or other agreements established between agencies and non-federal organizations, small businesses, us. And was developed for use on contract or other non-federal information systems and networks to protect CUI. That's from a memorandum from the Undersecretary for Defense. And so there is a little bit of a difference between NIST 800-171 and DFARS Clause 7012 specifically. So 7012 is written for defense contractors in contract language. Requires contractors to provide adequate security for covered defense information. And while that sounds like another nifty acronym to cover something else, it is actually very simple. It is CUI that is specified as a part of a defense contract. So CDI is CUI within the context of defense contract work. The U.S. government department is a part to be CDI. The contract agency, the government agency must, or is supposed to, specify what CUI that contractor will be exposed to, have access to, be using, or be generating as a part or performance of their contract. And I say it's supposed to because it isn't necessarily written in stone. There are provisions that say, hey, if a contractor isn't just providing adequate security, that there are other mechanisms that can be used to help them either fulfill that need or act as a punishment. But in general, we expect those folks that we are doing the work for to tell us exactly what elements are CUI. And it's probably incumbent upon us to help that process along a little bit. Hey, by the way, are you sure you want to make sure, you want to make sure that you're identifying this for us so that we know that that's something that we need to be protecting. And as a part of 7012, this is probably one of the more interesting parts, it specifically says that in order to protect that CDI or that CUI, we expect you to implement the guidelines and recommendations from NIST SP 800-171, again, from the Undersecretary for Defense. And together, both of those direct that when non-federal organizations, again, so this is our systems, and we're doing our work in support of the government on our systems, use, hold, store, process, or transmit controlled information, CUI, including covered defense information, CDI, that those security controls must be applied to protect it. And should a breach or incident occur, it has to be properly reported. And those reporting mechanisms are specified both in the contract and in those regulations. So that was pretty quick so far. Any pause points, any questions? It's all good, life is great, and it's after lunch. Excellent. So controlled unclassified information specifically was identified and sort of categorized by executive order back in 2010, which was one of the originators or the originating times when we were bringing all this stuff together. Remember I said that the groundwork had been set for this many years ago. It had been deferred a couple of times and passed a couple of times, but in the end, compliance has been required since December of 2017. Compliance to a certain degree, there have been some caveats there and some allowances for organizations to kind of catch up with where they should be. The National Archives and Records Administration is the one responsible for categorizing and maintaining policy and describing what those things are. And so this is one of the parts that's really unique about CUI. You know, as we're doing our defense work, working for the Department of Defense, we're fairly familiar with protecting information. But CUI can apply to just about any element of data or information that is held by or specified by any other part of the government. So, for instance, Department of Transportation may hold data identified as, or may have data identified as critical infrastructure, CRIT. It's a CUI identifier. The net worth of someone, there's a CUI identifier for it. Student records. So many of these things aren't obvious right off the bat, but when doing work even outside of the Department of Defense, that there may be CUI identified, and that information must still be protected within the constraints and standards listed within NIST 800-171. And as I had noted before, CDI is not all that complicated, other than CDI is defense information that includes CUI. So CUI covered within a defense contract is CDI. The means of protecting being the same, the response to an incident or breach being a little bit more specified in that there are certain timelines, certain agencies that must be identified and notified specifically when something has occurred. There are also requirements for supporting further investigations should those need to occur. So in protecting CUI, within NIST 800-171, they established 14 families of controls. These are just the overarching families. In total, there are just over 100 more specific directions that cover many of those. But I would like to go through those a little bit in a little bit more detail, not 110, we won't go crazy. But I'd like you to look at those very closely, because what we found early on as we were kind of beginning this journey towards being compliant is that there isn't necessarily a technological solution to meet all of these. And so what we found is that, hey, this is more of a people and process thing, or it can be more of a people and process thing depending on which area you're interested in. So for instance, if you look at personnel security and you're a small business leader, you're in charge of hiring the right people and maintaining their personal security status. That isn't something that you can necessarily buy from a servicing agency or for somebody else from a personal security as a service. I don't think they exist. And one that I used as an example earlier, one of the requirements is for awareness and training. And so while you can buy a service that provides cybersecurity and awareness and training and have it available, if you're not certain or you're not making sure that your employees are fully engaged in that cyber awareness training program, just having a program isn't enough. You have to have evidence that they are in fact participating. Another part of the awareness and training is not just a generalized awareness and training, but if you have any folks who are specifically handling CUI within any particular construct that is yours alone, so you have a new software tool or widget that is using CUI in a particular way, you are still responsible under 800-171 for ensuring that those personnel are properly trained to handle and use those tools. And so that, in many cases, isn't something that you can buy either. That is a process that you'll have to establish yourself to be in compliance. Well, that was pretty quick. So before we go on to our compliance journeys, are there any specific questions or generalized questions about what we've covered so far? That was kind of meant to set the stage for what is NIST 800-171, what is CUI, CDI, and so that we can begin to talk in a little more detail about what that means specifically. Anybody? Okay, so we did our initial introductions, and that was real fast. So I'll ask each of our panelists to spend a moment, do a quick introduction, talk about your company, and then your compliance journey and anything that you see as important. Please take it away. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay. I was looking
You
at
can sit down there if you
Genesis
like.
first. Okay. Well, that makes it even easier. I can sit down.
Well, that's
All
what I
right.
figured.
So, Bob Hall, I'm Chief Troublemaker for Sabine Solutions and Assured Bridge. Oh, President too, but I think you'll see the troublemaker portion. So, I'm of the opinion, all right, that we're at war right now. Why are we here? Because we're at war, and it's a cyber 360-degree, 3 to 5 extra dimensions, all day, every day war. And there's no parades for the soldiers going off to this war, but what we do have, and we've talked about it in this conference and lots of whatever in the news, is there's little teams, there's whole organizations, Cyber Command, etc., all fighting this war, either under the covers, behind the scenes, the man behind the curtain, etc. And they're all smarter than I am, but one of the pieces that I look as evidence, and Dan already referred to it, is everybody in this room that has a clearance, and that's probably about 90% at least, your information is done, all right? It's our adversaries, our competimates, even our teammates all have access to our full life history and security info. It's there, it's out there right now, and and this is in addition to what you lose just by being connected. The fact you've got cell phones and all the rest of the stuff, and it's a connected world. So we're at risk, and our part, in my mind, right now is, securing that controlled, unclassified information. That's what we can do right now. In addition to whatever support all the small businesses and folks in this room provide to DOD or other federal government agencies and whatever, which implies that we absolutely have to meet NIST 800-171, the DFARS clauses, etc. I mean, I don't know about everybody else in this room, but at least 10 times in the last year, I've had to sign off on acceptance of a contract that says I'm in compliance with NIST 800-171. And I know nobody is going to say, no, I don't want this contract. I'm not in compliance. We know that doesn't happen, right? But, that's what we're talking about here. And, when we first looked at this, Dan and I and a whole group of people, my first thought as a technologist, however low level that might be, was, wow, this is a cool problem. We can make a solution for it. We can build it. We can make it happen. But the second thought, as the president, not just the chief troublemaker of these companies, is this is taking money right off my bottom line. It's going to cost resources, money. We've got to invest all of that to be compliant. And that's one of the reasons why it took over 2 years before they finally got down to the December 31st, you must be compliant. Everybody in this room compliant? Any hands? There we go. 2. All right, great. Right?
Well, I'm thinking he was going to say they're not.
Exactly. Well, but this is recorded. Right? Wide open world, lines of communication. All right. So I agree with Dan. We and all the rest of the small business community, we've got to change and adapt how we do business. Right? It doesn't have to be drastic, but we do have to change, or we're not going to get the contracts, we're not going to get the work, and we won't make any money. And so what comes off of our bottom line won't matter because we won't have one. All right, so, you know, and how does that work? You know, how many people consistently, every day, every communication, send their email encrypted? I'll make it easier. How many people have an ECA cert to their name and their company in this room? Again, about 2, 3, 4, maybe 10. You should have one, your contract guy, all right? But, you know, that's acceptable encryption according to the standards of NIST 800-171, right? So there's that. You know, how many people have a whole bunch of prop data and old information sitting on their laptops, sitting on a G drive, Dropbox, wherever, private little external drives that they plug in every now and then when they need an exemplar from an old proposal, for example. Not that anybody reuses old proposal material, right? All right, so it's all out there, right? And it needs to be protected, you know. But even more important can be, you know, our processes and procedures, right? They're all available through our comms. I mean, people know when Bob and team are cranking on a proposal, all of a sudden the email's heating up, we're sending emails back and forth. If we're really compliant, we're using our collaborative environment to make it happen, all right? And so we don't have to send all those encrypted emails, right? But that's just a few things, you know, you can see just in the comms, right? And then on top of that, you know, all the rest of the communications and where our data's sit. You know, how many people actually use, in a small business, a collaborative environment where all their prop documents sit in a common area, that's secure, and that's the only way people can get to it. We've all worked with large companies where that's mandated. You know, if you're providing support, they've got some kind of place you drop your input in, whatever. How many small businesses have the equivalent set up and operating on a regular basis? I won't make anybody raise their hands because I pretty much know what the answer is. It is all on my laptop, I'll tell you, right? We all know that, right? So how do we address the policy? How do we secure the technology? You know, and this is all before we've got our DSS reps, for those of you who have facility clearance, and those who don't, because if you do business, those same DSS reps are gonna come and be tapping their toes at some point or requiring you to fill out those yearly self-assessments and or in person, you know, wanting to look at your records, and they're going to want actual proof that you're doing the stuff that Dan was just talking about. You're meeting those 14 requirements and the 100+ subtasks that are all part of that. And I understand that, you know, it's just like getting your system scanned by one of your IA reps. You get 10,000 issues that pop up and 9,999 of them don't really apply. But you still have to explain the fact why they don't apply, right? So, you know, what we've got to do is we've got to secure our data, our laptops, and our storage areas in a secure, compliant manner. You know, we've got to secure our comms, right, in a compliant, secure manner. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. And we need to secure our business processes. Every small business in this room has either a business process, an actual intellectual property of some form, or just stuff you don't want everybody to know about, right? And is it secure? And when I say secure, compliant according to this set of regulations and everything else, that means it's monitored, right? It's audited. There's reporting that occurs as a result of any issue, right? And I can tell you, you know, people say, oh, you just need this VPN. Well, every single free VPN or cheap VPN that you look at on the internet now, their key points are anonymity, and they don't look at your goodies. And they may be secure, but those are 180 degrees out of the requirement for this, because you've got to monitor, you have to audit, you have to, you know, certify that you are compliant. And that's just on the communications portion. That's nothing to do with how you secure your data. So anyway, you know, this is what we do, and one of the reasons we're here is we built our solution. It's a shared bridge, and it's all based on a shared compliance model, but I'm not going to go into a marketing pitch right now. I'm going to hand it over to Angie.
Thanks, Bob. So I have 2 microphones. I'm loud anyway, so I'll just go ahead and speak loudly. I think I'm good. If you can't hear me, just let me know. My name is Angie Leinert. I'm President and CEO of Intelligenesis. We don't have a tool or anything that I'm pitching. It's more just the experience that I had and making sure that my company was compliant. And that's kind of what I'll speak to you a little bit about today, as well as just some of the overall research that I did that is now readily available on the web, where when we started this journey about 18 months ago, it was very, very difficult, especially for a small business. I mean, we already had our safeguards in place as a defense contractor working for the intelligence community. We already know how, or at least we thought we knew, how to protect the data. We had our processes. We thought we were good to go. And then the NIST requirements came out, and we read through it all and said, oh my gosh, this is just enormous. How is my small business going to be able to implement all of these requirements? And so it was really hard to digest at first. Then once you actually go through it and realize that it's not a one-size-fits-all. There's not one specific requirement or solution that you're expected to comply with and go out and spend millions of dollars on some type of software for you to be able to adhere to all of the different requirements they have. Then it's a little more digestible. And what you realize as you go through it and you do the documentation and you start your processes is that it's actually helping you out too as a business. It's putting maybe some processes that you already had in place, refining them a little bit, making sure that, okay, we'll put our passwords in place for our users to log in. Well, we don't want to have to remember 12 characters. We'll do 5. We'll do 7. So because of the requirements, it was actually enabled us to better secure our information and better protect our company. So I'm not going to speak as long as I have 2 other people, and I really want to get to your questions. But some of the things that, again, now that the information is readily available, things that I like to Google is how, what do defense contractors need to know about NIST? What is important? Where do I start first? Because if I just go to the special publication and read through everything, that is way too much for me. I try to say that I'm technical, but I'm not that technical. So I'm not going to be able to understand everything. So the most important part for me as an executive and as president was to know what was going on with my organizations, to be able to conduct that assessment, to work with my technical folks to go through and make sure that we were taking the steps and making sure that we were doing what we were supposed to. And then areas where there were gaps, we could then go and document that, figure out what we needed to put in place, knowing that we had time to do that as well. And then we have to continue to go through and monitor and audit. So the steps that I want to tell you about that I think are pretty easy are, again, to initially create that NIST compliance, kind of the risk management assessment, just going through the assessment. It's online for you. It tells you to write yes, write no, write is not applicable, but it kind of walks you through some of those steps, and that's really the first place that you want to start. And then from there to start to pull some of the compliant access controls, figure out what it is that your organization needs, what you're currently using, and what's available to you, and then to be able to prepare to manage and audit. The documentation is definitely one of the biggest parts of that as well, and to make sure that your leadership is on board with what you're doing. Some of the other suggestions is kind of 6 basic steps is to be able to locate, categorize, limit, encrypt, monitor / audit, and train. And those are by far the most important steps, kind of wrapped up in a nutshell. So, thank you.
Hey, I'm Randall Zapata with Zapata Technology. We do a lot of software services for the defense sector. We support several Intel platforms. Recently, we just won Inc. 5000 for the 3rd time, so we've seen tremendous growth. We're doing really well overall as an organization. And when we first got told we had to do this, from one of my techs came up to me and said, hey, I think we need to be doing this. And I'm like, uh-oh. So we start really looking at it. It really was like this Y2K type phenomenon. Like, oh my gosh, world's going to end come December. We're going to be, and really, we really started to break it down. And it really wasn't too bad for our size of the company. So we're about 60 employees right now. I would say we put a lot of money to get it done. So I'd say about 1/3 was probably in license costs and tech, and then 2/3 was actually in labor and processes and procedures. But from what I can tell personally is at 60 employees, it wasn't that bad. And I think we're all around the same size. It's the challenge is really that 15 or less employees, right? Like, I see they essentially have to do just about the same amount of work as what I did, same amount of money practically, because you have to bring in all these systems and processes, and then also you have to add in some tech on top of it. And so that's really the challenge that I see is how does that very small startup get this accomplished? I know we have partners that we've had to help for free. We've offered services just to help them get them to that next level. And that's where I see the biggest challenge is how these startups get accomplished what they need to do. So.
Jay Roy, Omni Technologies. We are a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business. We do solution and service. We provide solutions and services for the Department of Defense and the intel community, primarily focused on the Army, Navy, the Air Force, as well as the three-letter guys as a part of that as well. As the team here has mentioned, as a small business, we identified that we had a little bit, I'll say, of a different experience because of our background as a professional services in relation to cybersecurity for the DoD and the intel community. We're very familiar with the implementation of cybersecurity-related controls, which this kind of ties into, whether it's technical and or administrative. So whether that be TTPs in relation to processes and techniques and different tools that we use as a part of that in relation to that, or the integration and or development of tools and technologies ourselves internally to help to do this. So we had a little bit of a different experience, but in relation to that experience, what we learned as well is we rest assured that this is just the beginning of where the government is going in regards to compliance for contractors. As Bob alluded to, for many years now, we've been dealing with issues of adversaries, whether that's our competimates, stealing intellectual property, foreign nation states, et cetera, stealing from our big defense contractors and primarily our small defense contractors as a part of it as well. It's been something that we've been dealing with. The implementation of these controls puts us at a quasi-baseline, so we can basically track metrics in regards to what each of us should be doing in relation to that. I have no doubt in my mind the government is going to continue to tighten the screws on this as it continues to evolve. So it's very important that we as companies get a hold of what these requirements mean to us now and how what our implementation status is at this particular point in juncture, and that we continue to evolve as a part of this as well.
Great. Already? We were going to do a wrap up. Please go right ahead. So we're recording these. So you gotta please introduce yourself and the company you represent, and that's your question.
Yeah, my name is J.O. Richardson. I represent Cockwell Webbs and Associates. Could you explain a little bit more about what agencies are doing that you have to sign off that you're in compliance with the NIST standards? Because a lot of companies probably are not going to become compliant unless they are forced to. And if you sign off, you're signing a government document that you don't want to sign a document from a fraudulent nature unless you've actually done that work. I used to be an old contracting officer before I retired, so you don't want to do that. So could you please explain that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So several of the contracts that I've looked at, and there's a couple of primes. I'm small, so I don't have a lot of prime contracts, right? But it's been part of the contracting effort that you self-certify clauses that refer to that DFARS clause, right? And actually has the language in it that says you protect the data provided in accordance with NIST 800-171, et cetera. It's a standard DFARS clause that's been in 3 different contracts in the last 4 months that I've signed, and several others in the last year and a half. I mean, it's part of it, and one of it depends on the primes too, because you get flow down as a subcontractor whether you know it or not, right? I mean, you know that. And your prime is not going to take responsibility for your data spill. That's why they make you have insurance and everything else, and pro insurance and all that liability. But I mean, so it's there, all right? And I can tell you one of the primes has been SAIC and several other large companies that just come straight out, and that clause is part of that huge laundry list of things you sign off and say. I mean, how many people in here, every time they see that list of DFARS clauses, goes back and looks at every single DFARS clause before they sign it?
Well, and not to
as a
interrupt you,
subcontract.
Bob, but they're coming out of the proposals now too, and the large companies that have it for the questionnaires to make sure generally before you go into a teaming agreement or a subcontractor agreement, they're gonna have you go through the questionnaire and do the same thing to vouch for it. So it's pretty
Yeah.
standard language now. You should see it in all the different proposals and the contracts that are being awarded. And if you don't, you should ask about it. And before you sign anything, you should read through it.
So for each of our panelists then, have each of you seen contracts now that include that language specifically?
Yes.
Yeah, I've seen it as well.
Yep.
Thank you. First, a comment. My name is Jim Masella. I'm with Coal Fire Systems. My job is to spread hate and discontent. So we're an auditor, and we do 800-171 assessments. So I wanted to share what we're seeing with our primary customers, our commercial clients, cloud service providers that host federal data. And what we've seen over the last year is that during their FedRAMP assessments, they're asking for an additional assessment report and attestation letter from us as a third-party assessment organization saying that they are compliant. So I'm curious to see if you've had that experience, if anybody is going back and checking on your self-attestations, or if you're getting any pushback from some of your partners.
I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, not from my perspective. It's a self-attestation, we're in compliance, yay and verily. And, I've been to several conferences that include the ISOO folks who manage the whole NIST side of the requirements, not necessarily the DFAR, but the NIST side. And they keep talking about that train is coming, right? We've seen recently, within the last 3 months, DSS is going to be the responsible party. We know how fast DSS works, all right? And so, but it's coming. I mean, I fully anticipate within the next at least 2 years, my DSS rep is going to add to that facility clearance self-inspection that we have to do every year, a whole section on NIST 800-171 compliance. That's going to be there. And at some point, and it just depends on whether they get a wild hair and decide to come see you personally or not. If they're there in person, or they accept your self-inspection and wait till next year. But it's coming. It's not even a freight train right now. It's just part of the road. Yes, sir.
And so what we have seen, there are actually tools that are available to us now that will help us maintain that compliance profile. So two of the things that are normally asked for, normally specified as references, a document that is a partner to NIST 800-171 is NIST 800-171A. It is the self-assessment form for compliance. And then, which acts as your SSP, Security System Plan, System Security Plan, and a POAM, which is your preventive actions and
Plan of action and
Plan of actions and milestones document as well. So those two documents specifically are the things that can be used to help define, prove, and as evidence of your compliance. And so as long as you have those two available, and like I say, the 800-171A is available. It's there for folks to download should they choose to fill it out themselves. It is very step-by-step, yes, no, and a couple of system descriptions. But it's a very good tool for, one, starting a self-assessment to kind of see where you are, and also to kind of guide you through what those important steps are that you need to cover, and can then be used as your self-attestation evidence for your level of compliance, with your POA&M being the, hey, I identified a couple of steps here that I am not quite up to yet, but I list them here, and this is what my plan of action is and my timeline to go and address those.
John Doran from Mission Essential. I had a question or just a comment. With this coming on board and all of the applications that are coming with it as well, I'm sure there's many of the vendors, some of the larger vendors and all that would or are going to start providing applications to ease the whole process. Have you all seen any of these applications, especially for small business and larger businesses they have a lot of the applications that seem to work in compliance with the requirements. But have you seen it more affordable, or do do you foresee applications that will be more affordable in that area?
So I think the benefit you have, well, at least with the people up here, is we're all technology companies, right? So I think Jay said it best, that we already kind of have our own monitoring and mechanisms in place. We're cybersecurity experts, so we know what to look for and what we're doing. But there are, if you just Google, try to get more information about it, there's tons of companies that come up that have different software that's available to you, and that would possibly make sense. I don't know what the cost is associated with it for companies that obviously aren't very good at technology or that's not their forte. They're going to have to do something else. But because there's so many out there now, I'm sure that'll drive that cost down. So, 18 months ago there weren't, but now you can pick up a rock and throw and hit somebody that has some type of solution.
And one of the costs that we've seen is the amount of money, though, like the basic model for some of these software vendors, it can be relatively high for a startup, right? And so for us on the panel, maybe not so bad. If you're a 10 or 15 person startup, to me that's the challenge. It's dropping thousands of dollars for these software components. But software, what I would say is a small piece of it. To me, it's the labor, the overhead dollars that you have to pay to put it in place. The software is just a small piece. It's the labor that really, the internal labor.
A lot of companies do that from end to end now. They'll come in, do the assessment, put the software, they put the whole plan and stuff in place. But again, those used to be crazy. Now there's so many of them. It's not
As we've done our continuing research on what this really looks like, what we've run into in many cases is there are a lot of options that are available for consulting services, right? Someone will come in, do an initial assessment, and kind of give you a list. This is where you need to go. And so that's been one of them. We have seen a couple that have popped up, probably in the last 6 months. One specifically that said, you buy this and you're compliance. And that's one that I really wanted to caution folks against, is that as we've talked about here, more than 25% of being in compliance is a people and process task. And you can't buy a people or process task. That is something that you have to integrate internally and take on as a part of your everyday operations. And so I'm often cautious when I see something that says, hey, you just pay us once and you're in compliance, because that likely isn't the case. But there are more solutions that are popping up. Like I said, primarily consulting, because it is I think it's probably a difficult thing for many folks to do, to say, hey, you pay us and then we'll take on your risk for you. So that risk transference is something that folks have to be very careful of, especially as a small business.
Yeah, I would just to add to your point, if you're paying a consultant X amount of dollars, you're probably paying twice that in internal labor to make whatever the consultant's telling you to do possible, right? Adding those policies and procedures in place. As a small business, right? You really have to invest time being compliant.
This is J.R. Richardson. There were some new rules that were coming out. There was some draft that was published. I believe that was by DOD. Could you guys address that? There was some new NIST or DOD standards for compliance.
There's been a revision to 800-171, so that was just released, I think 6 months ago when the last revision. So there's a NIST 800-171 revision 1, which is the current version. I think the draft you're talking about is 800-171A, which is that self-assessment form. That had been in draft for a long time, and I think it was only approved and released officially within the last couple of months.
Sure.
Does that answer your question? I haven't seen anything else specifically relating to contractor use or contractor responsibilities for protecting COI yet.
That could have been the DFARS piece.
So my name is Dave McKinney with Mobile Iron, and I wanted to follow up on the question that Jim had. Just wanted to confirm what I thought I heard, is that today there's no government agency or department that is responsible for oversight and compliance that checks and verifies, certifies that people are meeting the 171. It's basically honor system, self-cert.
There is a government agency in charge. It's the ISOO, National Archives. Overall, they're in charge. Now, but they've also stated that they don't have a team going out checking your systems and your company for actual compliance yet. I mean, they just now, within 3 months, designated DSS as the responsible agency for government contractors.
And that's for defense.
For defense.
Right.
That doesn't apply to the defense cement mixer company that's providing cement to a government facility building effort that also has to meet these same requirements.
And so what they've talked about, especially in a couple of these from the ICU presentations and stuff, is that the governor is aware that they need to get to the point where they have an effective method for measuring. They don't have it yet. They have plans in place. And they say it'll be a couple of years yet before they can actually do that. But what they do have is, right now, they have some legal fallback that they can go to. And that is, if there's a spillage, and if that spillage is noted to be at fault of non-protection, non-compliance, then there is at least a legal recourse. And so from a small business perspective, we look at this from risk, right? So yes, we could probably self-certify and say, yeah, I'm good enough. I'll take care of it. And then you are then accepting that risk. That risk then falls directly on your shoulders. So should something occur, there goes small business. And so from a risk management or risk awareness perspective, that's just something as small business leaders we just have to be aware of, make sure that we understand what that really means to us. Any other questions, please?
So just curious, from a small business who's trying to break into the DoD and they have to have these requirements in place, would it behoove them to have a third-party certification to include with their proposals to show that they are indeed certified? And is that a thing?
So it's a really good question, and it's one that's probably
like he
better
would say,
one.
it's cost preventative, I think, for a lot of
Well,
companies.
it's one from, in many cases when you're trying to bid on a government contract, that your response is constrained and maybe prohibitive from providing additional specific information, such as your compliance information may not be a part of your authorized page count, for instance. But having that information available should either the government or, if you're working for a prime, should one of those ask specifically, it would certainly behoove you to have that information available and ready.
Yeah, if I was an entrepreneur just starting up, I wouldn't invest the capital, because you're already limited capital when most companies when they start up are very limited on capital, so I wouldn't invest the money for an audit. This is me personally.
Especially when you can self-certify. The
Right.
requirement's not there, so you can put it kind of in place. I would spend my money elsewhere.
Right.
So I think it goes back to a cost-benefit analysis in that regard for each company. There are going to be some businesses, as we've discussed, that have the capital, the means to be able to do those type of things and execute, and then others that just for whatever reason, even honestly, if they're larger than that, the capital is an issue, right, in regards to being able to bring in third-party auditors to do that. I think we can say with some level of consistency right now that there's no acquisition officer that's asking for this specific information in regards to them making an acquisition decision, right? But the reality is we know that's coming, right? It's being integrated into the cybersecurity process in that regard. That's the culmination of DSS now being the executive agent as a part of this. And what they're going to do is tie this into what they do for facilities as a part of this in the future, as well as what they do for networks in that regard as well. So, it's coming in that regard. But as of right now, I would say from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, it probably wouldn't behoove you other than to do your own internal IV&B. And then identify what tools and technologies, TTPs basically, that you yourself need to bring in-house to help you to become compliant, depending upon what your current posture is in relation to meeting these compliance controls.
Yeah, I'd like to jump on what Jay just said. Is if you're going to spend the money, I wouldn't spend the money on a report. I'd spend the money on becoming compliant.
Yeah.
Bottom line.
Well, I'll say this: staying compliant, right?
There you go.
That's where your implementation of managed services. So first you want to assess and figure out where you are, but then you want to manage your service to ensure that you stay compliant, because the controls are going to continue to evolve. They may not come out, every 6 months with a new implementation, but the reality is the next go-around there's going to be additional controls added to this. which for us is going to translate into hundreds of actionable tasks, which for us is going to translate to thousands of technical things that we have to do, whether it's we've got to write a document that speaks to this specific process, we've got to refine something in regards to our TTPs and how we do our workflows as a part of this as well. So this is going to translate to more level of effort for us as contractors going forward in the future. So it's best for us to get in front of this now rather than waiting for the hammer to drop on us later.
Oh, absolutely agree. I think one of the other things that we need to be thinking about, so I do some additional consulting for non-defense, non-government contract small businesses as well. And in many cases, the same things that we're telling our commercial folks or other small businesses doing work totally unrelated to government operations is to do these very same things. And so what we're finding is that, well, once again, many of these processes or requirements may seem onerous. In the end, it's actually the right way to be doing business, to protect your intellectual property, to protect your daily operations, to protect your financial status, to protect your personal contact list, any programs you're working on, any software developing, widgets, tools, manufacturing facilities. Many of these very same steps can be applied across the board. And so we've kind of gotten, I don't want to say that we're lazy. We've taken the path of least resistance for many years, just kind of doing enough to get by. And what we've found, of course, what we hear in media all the time, what we see on the news, what in many cases many of us are exposed to, is that the adversaries are there and they're busy. They are making money. The way they make money is by, in many cases, impacting our ability to do so. So it is in our best interest, just as small business leaders, just as running a business, to begin implementing these things to protect what we do. And in the end, that delta between being compliant from just a business operations perspective, the delta between that and being fully compliant to meet the NIST standards is actually much lower.
Do you guys think that instead of just a compliance requirement, you'll ever have a certification that's going to be required and will also benefit for public sector as well?
In the end, yes, mostly from an insurance perspective. I have spoken with some insurance providers those that offer business insurance, and there are elements now of insurance which is protection for cyber incidents.
Yep.
Many of them are now going through their own internal development process to figure out how do we make sure that we're not assuming too much risk when we provide insurance to another small business. And one of their mechanisms for doing that will again be an assessment. And I think that will probably be one of the nearer term steps, because of course we know why the insurance company exists. They exist to make money, and they certainly don't want to lose it. And so I would see them moving a little bit faster than any other compliance or certification standards that might exist, specifically directed with working with the government. Yes, sir? Did you have a question, sir? No.
Just, Dan, one quick thing as well. I think it's also important for us as businesses in general as well to identify this to our vendors as a requirement for them. If you think about the managed services that we utilize ourselves to operate and function our business, whether you're buying collaborative services from Microsoft or Exchange or to Microsoft Word, Outlook Online, whatever the case may be. You've got different other, type of managed services. Think about your vendor if you're using someone that's consulting for you for finance or operations or whatever the case may be. These people have access to your data just like you do, right? So you need to be asking them the same questions that the government's asking you as a contractor doing business for them in regards to how they're protecting your data, because in the future, that's going to be a part of the flow down as well. What are you doing for managed services that are outside of your daily operations? Other people, other vendors are actually managing your data as a part of this as well.
Any other questions, folks? So I think that wraps it up, unless any parting comments or any final comments from our panel here? So thank you very much for participating in our little get-together here. I hope we've all learned something from each other. I have put some resources up there, and I believe, Amy, you noted that the slides will be available for download, so you can get this information, and please feel free to use it. My contact info is there, as is all of ours. Please feel free to contact us and ask questions, should you have them. I'm sure all of us would be more than happy to help out other small businesses and provide whatever support we can.
Just a few other things. You can get CPU or CPE credits. I have a volunteer in the back that can scan your badge for you. I also want to thank our Small Business Workshop sponsor, Victoria Washington, who's the president and CEO of Vision Information Technology Consulting. And lastly, actually, one of our panelists, Intelligenesis, is the sponsor of our local AFCEA chapter here does a small business roundtable on a monthly basis. This year we're partnered with the Clubhouse and Intelligenesis, and the Beer and Bites is this afternoon at 1700. You keep walking down the river a little bit. It's at the Cyber Hall McKnight building, the 3rd floor. So hope we can see you there for some more networking. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you to the panelists.
Okay.
Take a minute, but we'll get that to happen.
Sweet. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah. We're with the mouse last weekend.
Nice and very
Cool.
warm.
Yeah. Fun. All right, I'll see you. Good seeing you.
Hit up after anytime. Let me know.
Yeah, we can do lunch or something.
Yeah, let's get you.
All right.
Dan, good to see you. Bud.
You as well. Sorry, we didn't have much time to interact.
It's fine. I did updates to the slide last night in Google Docs that didn't make it for whatever reason. Oh, okay. If you want to look at that before I post it, yeah.
I mean, they're going to post what I already sent.
At least you got their
That I
attention.
will look at.
Okay.
When's
I
next?
saw your note last night, and it was
Oh, the
some other
1500.
activity. I said, you know what?
Yeah, we got an hour.
Like I told you, I'm working on a proposal till late. Oh my goodness, yeah.
Proposal. You have to get more business in order to get the business in order to keep doing business.
I'm finally getting a BD guy that's going to come in and take over a lot of the heavy lifting down there.
But don't beat them up too bad.
Yeah. We'll see.
Take care.
How you doing today, sir?
How you doing, man?
How you doing, sir? Jay.
Antonio.
Pleasure to meet you.
Same here.
Pleasure to meet you.
You mentioned that Intel world.
Yeah.
You're an analyst or something at this point?
When I came out of the military, I was doing system engineering and went to work on DoD contracting out of the Army.
Right.
And then quickly spawned into basically fast forward a couple of years, becoming an executive, and I've been doing DoD and IC for the last 15 plus years now. Yeah, so, we're doing well. We're at 55. Yeah, we're services able, veteran owned, small business. Oh, no. Oh, you good? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
All right. That's what we were just talking about. So our packet is already in. You mentioned you guys are going to get started. Our packet is already in. We're on the, so there's, from what I know thus far, there's like 4 reviews that happen, right? We're at the tail end of review. I actually got a phone. I was telling them I got off the plane as soon as I landed. I got a phone call asking me some additional questions. He said, yeah, I'm gonna say I just need a couple more things. Hopefully this thing lines up for us. Yeah, happening.
So you know this offshore?
Yeah. A little bit. Her shop has been so they got a lot. And honestly, Kindle gamers, they've been doing a lot as far as changing their acquisition strategy, how their interface is all good stuff. And the reality is it's brought along a lot of small businesses that weren't paying attention. So now it's a load. It's a load. So the biggest thing for us is the fact that we're already there. We're already in the game. We done actually even as a small business, we're like textile.
So you know Millennium Kevin and Seth?
I know of them. You say my name, they might know me too. Yeah, I know of them.
Good, I hope.
Yeah. I would say pretty good stuff. We competitive. We've competed against each other in a couple of years. Yeah. So we know all of the same people.
One of the things that I was talking to Eric and other people too is humanity. When you get your 8A and stuff, and I'm just saying in general, when you get your 8A and you find a company that you trust, throughout your cycle of being an 8A, and you work with them, go
The thing that I was telling your COO is the fact that you were saying you guys are getting acquisition officers, technical officers, no. Process is still like that. You know, it's supposed to be 90 days. They're not capable.
Robinson or whatever it is, 30 days, they were flipping, and then they say when she got on board, she would be call you or her staff would call you and say, hey, you forgot to add so and so. And you tell them, okay, I'll send it back to you.
They don't do that anymore. They don't do that anymore. And plus, they did the implementation of trying to automate it even more with the new certified system, which is great because what the reality is they're still learning the tool. They're still learning